Hello, I'm Paul Perrello, and welcome to the Philly Factor. Well, have you ever thought about writing a screenplay? Yeah, I'm talking to you. Have you ever thought about writing a screenplay? Do you sit through the end of the credits at a movie and read the word screenplay by, and you want to know what is a screenplay and who is that person that writes a screenplay? Well, we're going to get to the bottom of those questions and so many more as we welcome back to the Philly Factor Jim Rosin. Jim is an actor, he's a writer, author, screenwriter, and he's here to join us to talk about screenwriting. And Jim, it's always a pleasure to have you back on the program.
Well, it's fun to come back.
Well,
always good to see you.
Well, thank you, I appreciate that. Screenwriter, screenplay, we look at the credits at the end of a movie and people say, oh, that's nice, if people are even staying to watch the credits at the end of the movie. But what exactly is this area of movie making entertainment known as screenwriting? What exactly do we mean by screenwriting?
Well, screenwriting is really the script. It's the foundation, because when you think about it, movies, television shows, everything is predicated on the printed page. Mm-hmm. So basically, when you write a screenplay or a teleplay, you create a story, and you create characters, and you create the dialogue, the things that they say and do. And nowadays, it's changed a little bit from years ago where a lot of writers would indulge in camera directions. Now, especially with spec scripts, speculation scripts, they stay away from that because writers want the full attention of the people reading it to absorb the story. So they write very simply, just basic directions, interiors when you're inside somewhere, exteriors if you're outdoors, any directions with regard to people doing things or going here or there, mm-hmm. and then the dialogue down the middle of the page. And in that way, they're not distracted by camera moves in or pulls back or point of view or time lapse, and you do put certain things in, certain directions, technical directions, when you feel it's very necessary, mm-hmm. but otherwise you stay away from it, especially when you're first submitting a script, because again, you want them to get a full sense of the story and the characters. And I think the two most important things in screenwriting are story content and characterization.
So when a person decides they're going to sit down and they're going to write a screenplay, it all begins with an idea. Most oftentimes, where I'm going with this is that oftentimes screenplays might be based on a book. So is that author, and we can pick any author if you will, we'll pick on Lisa Scottolini since she's a local author, okay?
Okay.
So let's say someone options her book, one of her many books. Will she be, or can she be, if she wants to, be the screenwriter for that screenplay based on her book?
It depends. It's a variable. Sometimes you see written by or screenplay by based on his book, mm-hmm. but quite often a novelist or someone that writes a book is not a screenwriter. They either have no experience in it or don't have any desire to go there. And when a producer options a book, he'll get a screenwriter mm-hmm. that's not only familiar with the format, but someone that really is very close to that phase of the business.
Yeah.
But sometimes you have a writer that will base his screenplay on his novel, on his book.
So you've written a few screenplays yourself. You've worked on a number of different projects. Ideas, because really that's where it all begins. I want to write a screenplay about 19th century Philadelphia and what it was like to live in Old City, and there's a murder that takes place. I mean, you could throw a whole bunch of ideas in a pot,
right.
But you got to have some sort of structure to all of those ideas, because if you're going to try to get that screenplay in front of someone, he or she doesn't want to necessarily look at all these ideas in this pot and try to figure out where the heck is this story going.
Yeah, a basic overview. Okay, now I'm painting in broad brushes here.
Right.
But the basic overall structure of a screenplay is a setup, the conflict, and the resolution.
Right.
The setup is the exposition. The beginning of a script is always expository in that you introduce the situation, you introduce the characters that are involved in the story and their relationships, and then as the screenplay is ongoing, you bring in the conflict. Because without conflict, you don't have drama.
Right.
The conflict, as the story wears on, it intensifies. Sometimes the conflict will remain the same. Sometimes you'll see the characters leap over the hurdle, but in leaping over, they come up against an even bigger conflict. The more conflict you have, I think the better off, because it involves your audience. So the conflict intensifies, and the latter part of the screenplay is resolution time. Now, sometimes the resolution is tightly wrapped up in a package with a nice bow around it, and other times it's not. What's important, I think, is that at the end of a screenplay or a teleplay, you at least have an understanding of if the character achieved his objective or he didn't, why. Now, along with those things, when I say story content and characterization, I'll back up a step. You want to write something that people will identify with,
Right.
people will relate to. And even before that, it's got to be something that you're inspired by. Inspiration goes a long way. So when you take a story or a subject that you're inspired by, you do your research, you start to formulate the ideas and the plot. You want to keep in mind that it's something that will appeal to the masses. When you get into the characterization part of it, you want your characters to be multidimensional. You want them to have layers, because people today are very savvy. And they want to see something where the characters, have multi-dimension, and that they're flawed. Not necessarily, if you go back to Rocky and Bullwinkle,
Right.
Dudley Do-Right
Sure.
and Little Nell. So Dudley Do-Right and Little Nell can have a little bit of Boris Badenoch and Natasha, if you can remember. They were always dressed in black.
We're really
right?
dating ourselves here with these cartoon characters, right?
So, and it's true. I mean, all of us there's some bad in all of us, but the preponderance is good. Now, when you have a heavy in a screenplay, it can be the reverse of that. But even if you have a heavy that has some compassion in him or some sensitivity or shows some act of kindness, it intrigues the audience, The main thing is that you want to be able to root for your protagonist, the main character in the story. And he has a clear-cut intention, and yet there are obstacles in his way. So he takes a path to overcome that. And in the end, hopefully, he achieves what he's looking for, and he's changed for the better. Those are really important points. Sometimes some screenplays are character-driven as opposed to plot-driven, so they move along a little more slowly, and sometimes there's a little violation in the structure because the emphasis is on the character. But basically, a plot-driven screenplay has its plot points, but again, you start out setting things up, you introduce the roadblocks, you intensify them, and then in the end you try to resolve them. That's a pretty good overview of what the screenplay structure is, and also with a teleplay.
But some of the things that you just outlined for us would also, I guess, could be applied to writing a book. But sometimes, just because you can write a book doesn't necessarily mean you can write a screenplay, and vice versa. But again, in order to have a book that's going to capture the attention of readers, you set the premise, you have to have conflict, and then you have resolution. But some people may try their hand at writing a book and a screenplay, or vice versa, but may not have equal success in doing both.
No, it's true. It's interesting. Sometimes, sometimes you have people that are very covetous of their book, and they want the opportunity to write the screenplay. And there's other people that just say, it's really not my genre.
Right.
There's a lot of money involved. It's a very high profile piece. I'd rather take, sell the rights, and then you as the producer, you get the person who you think is the screenwriter. Now they will sometimes, consult the author. There have been books that have not translated into movies.
Mm-hmm.
There are some that have translated very well, but sometimes you have a lot more freedom and latitude when you write a book. You can paint these pictures, and a person's imagination can take flight. In a screenplay, you're limited as to what you can show, and where if a book can give you this much, a screenplay, which can give you a lot, may give you this much.
So then is it the director who then takes that screenplay and sort of expands upon the ideas that may have been laid out in the screenplay?
Yes, the director, and especially in movies, the director is he's a very important part in the storytelling, and in the editing. It's very important. It's very significant when the way a film is directed and shot and the way it's edited. A good director that has a very good story sense will work closely with the writer. Why don't we rewrite this scene and have the characters do this or that? Why don't we take this out? Why don't we juxtapose this? He's an integral part. Whereas in television, especially like in series TV, the executive producers, most of them are writers, they're hyphenates. So they plot out the story at the beginning of the season, and then each one of them writes the script. Sometimes they go outside to a freelance writer, but more and more today with television, things are done in-house and rely less on freelance people, because all the executive producers know all the nooks and crannies, all the nuances of the characters and the plot and the way they want things to go, because they formulated it. So a director will come in, and if he's not one of the executive producers, he'll direct that episode, and he'll have a say in the casting along with the producer. Executive producer may be the writer, who may be the executive producer anyway. But outside of that, he really doesn't get into the ins and outs of the script and the subtleties. But in a film, your director has much more authority, I think, in that area.
So you write the screenplay. You think, because you feel it, that this is the next best great movie in the making. What do you do with that screenplay? Do you send it to a clearinghouse where it's shopped around to agents or directors or studios, or do you go knocking on doors? I mean, I've interviewed enough authors who have said, they've gone to, X amount of publishing houses to try to get someone to look at their manuscript, and they get rejection after rejection after rejection. So what do you do with the screenplay?
It is daunting, being having written a book or writing a screenplay or a teleplay. The process is daunting. The irony is this, that once you finish something, you think, like I said before, hey, the business is predicated on the printed page. I got it, here it is, I got the foundation. You're the producer here. You can get a director, you can get the actors, you can get the director of photography, you can get the grips and the gaffers and the transportation and the hair and the makeup people.
Right.
You get the whole crew. Here it is. Well, the problem is that you got everybody and their grandmother has a script these days. So you know, the supply and the demand. Now people will say, well, wait a minute, come on, there's cable stations now and there's a lot of product. And well, yeah, there is a lot of product, much more so than years ago, but still, there's a lot of people that have scripts out there. So what you really have to do is once you have a script and you've rewritten it and think it's a polished script and ready to be read by someone, you have to find an agent. Now, there are a lot of literary agents. The problem with literary agents today is that they don't want cold submissions, meaning they won't look at people that have no representation and maybe no credits submitting a script. They don't want to deal with it. What they will read is maybe a new writer who's been referred to them by maybe someone they know, a director or producer, because right away they say, oh, there's a deal in the workings here. So a lot of agents will read things on referral. A lot of other agents, most agents will not accept cold submissions. So you say,
So
well, wait a minute, how am I going to?
How do you get that referral?
Well,
I mean,
if you can't get the referral, you just have to keep knocking on doors till you find a second or a third tier agent. You don't want to go to someone like William Morris, Endeavor, or Creative Artists Agents because they're not going to be interested in you. They're high powered and involved in big financial matters. You want to get a second or maybe even a third tier agent that's a little hungry, that may be looking for someone that is willing to read what you've written, and if they like it, take it on. Another way is if you have a script and you think the script and you visualize certain actors that are right for the roles, and if those actors have a production company, you ask if you can submit it to the company. Now sometimes they'll say, no, we won't read anything that's unsolicited. You have to have an agent. But sometimes they'll say, yes, but you have to sign a release form absolving them of any, any piracy, or any plagiarism or any stealing of your property.
So, which is interesting because oftentimes we will see a movie, and then shortly after that movie becomes the big blockbuster that it becomes, there's a story that will come out in the newspaper, in the media, saying that so-and-so is suing such and such a company because they stole their idea for you fill in the blank. So is that what happens sometimes?
It happens sometimes.
Yeah.
But, I think the best way to go is to find someone that will front for you. I think it's more professional. It makes you look better that you have somebody advocating for you. I don't think it's as appealing to approach somebody with your hat in your hand.
Sure.
Even if you're a talented writer, because they'll look at you and say, well, wait a minute, if this guy is so talented, how come he doesn't have representation?
Right.
So I think it's really imperative to get somebody to, and then if you know of a company that is doing, developing things that are in your genre, in your ballpark, in your wheelhouse, you tell the agent, you say, these such and such productions, they're doing things like this. So then it's up to him to approach the development person at that company to see if they're interested in reading it and hence developing it. I think the mindset for me at this point in my life is once somebody was willing to read my script, not think, oh boy, now we're going to get it green lighted. It's to think, maybe I'll get to the next step. That's the realistic expectation.
Right.
And then once they read it and like it, and okay, the next step they submit it to a company, that's the next step, the company's reading it. Then if the company wants to develop it, that's the next step. It's still, there's no guarantee it's going to get made. But if it's a step-by-step process, I think that's the better way to expect something to happen rather than saying, oh boy, now I'm going to get this made, I'm going to get this made.
So you really do have to invest not only time in writing the screenplay, but you have to invest a lot of time and effort making sure that the screenplay moves through the proper channel, and then there's still no guarantee that it's going to be in the right hands of the right person. I'm sure there may have been cases or people that you know that thought they gave their screenplay to an agent, and for whatever reason, that agent just disappears one day, never to be heard of again, and so you have to start the process all over again. So if this is something you really want to do, not only are you passionate about the words that you put on the paper, but you've got to be passionate enough to make sure that you see this through all the steps in the process.
Yes, and I think again, it starts with inspiration. It goes a long way, because you create these characters, and you create this story that they're involved in, and they become like your family. They're in the room there with you when you're writing. You give them life. You make them angry. You make them happy. You make them sad. You cause them to react a certain way. So it's an investment, and it becomes very personal.
Yeah.
So, that carries you through the process, I think.
So when you sit down to write that screenplay, some people may say, well, all the rage right now are sci-fi movies. So I'm going to write a sci-fi screenplay. Should you write what you yourself enjoy, or do you find yourself acquiescing to what is the genre du jour of the day?
Well, there are a lot of genres. I mean, you have drama, you have romantic comedy, you have sci-fi, as you mentioned, you have horror, which is very big, you have black comedy, you have a lot of different genres. I say you pick the one that most appeals to you.
Right.
And you formulate a story that is personal to you, that again you think will appeal to the mass audience, that people will relate to, identify with. And then you create characters that you think are likable, that people will root for. And you give them clear-cut intentions. You set the conflicts in motion. And, hopefully someone picks it up and runs with it. And ultimately, people see it and take the journey with you and are moved by it and enjoy it. Sometimes it's a cathartic experience for an audience, especially if they see, as I mentioned before, a character overcome an obstacle and change for the better. And sometimes, the resolution is not quite what you expect, or sometimes there isn't. It's a jolt. I personally like to give something back to the audience because they've taken the journey with you. But that's what I would answer, that you pick something that inspires you, because to try to capitalize on a fad, your heart may not be in what you write.
Right.
If you pick something that's personal to you or that you really are enthusiastic about, and it's got to be one of those genres, then you put your heart and soul into it and run with it, and understand that when you write it at first, it'll be like Amateur Night at the Movies maybe, but then as you sit down and rewrite it, James Michener said that once, I never forgot it. He said, as I begin to rewrite and do a second and a third draft, then that separates the men from the boys.
Right, right.
And, he was a top-notch writer. Now, here's an example that he never really got too involved in screenwriting,
Yeah. But yet many of his books were adapted into blockbusters.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the book that I wrote about Adventures in Paradise was based on a book that he wrote, I believe it was called Tales of the South Pacific.
Yeah.
So, it's an interesting dynamic how sometimes someone can write a book, write a novel, which is, that's a formidable task.
Absolutely.
But then screenwriting, write the dialogue and well, wait a minute. The plot points are already formulated in your book. Yeah, but
What may work on the written page may not necessarily translate into something on the screen.
That's another thing. Sometimes the novelist will have blinders and not see that. But sometimes, a very good point, by the way, sometimes the novelist will see, you know what, I don't know that I'm capable of translating all that I've created. He might feel like he's shortchanging his audience. by writing a screenplay based on his book, because he doesn't think in 2 hours and on 100 pages he can capture everything that's in the book. Because as I said before, when you read a novel, boy, your imagination can take flight.
Yep.
You know, what you see on the screen is what you see.
Mm-hmm.
It's already, somebody's already put that down on the table for you, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So that's an interesting point. I didn't think of that, but yeah, there could be that concern on the part of the novelist.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we've answered some of the questions that the audience may have about screenwriting. If you're interested, there are many places. I mean, I hate to say go online and there's probably a YouTube video that shows you how to do it, because I think that may minimize really the amount of time and effort that you have to put into writing a screenplay. But there are so many resources out there, and if it's something that you're passionate about, go for it. You never know unless you try, right? So Jim, I want to thank you for being with us. Always a pleasure to have you here on the program.
Thank you so much.
Show as usual. And until the next time, I want to thank you for tuning in to the Philly Factor. My name is Paul Perrello. Thanks so much for being here with us on the Philly Factor.